All you got to do is read this book, talk about it a little bit, write an essay, try to do a good job. We'll get through it. It'll be all right.
What the hell does that even mean?
What you getting at with the book script? Spit that shit out, man!
When I was your age, television was called books.
Wait a minute. What's your favorite book?
Where you got the book?
In my hand, Doc! You got it in my hand!
Burn it!
Tells me that goose-stepping morons like yourself should try reading books instead of burning.
So, welcome back to the Propaganda Loves You Book Club, where we are continuing our journey with the Davids, Graeber, and Wengrow through the dawn of everything. This week we're discussing Chapter 9, which is called Hiding in Plain Sight, the Indigenous Origins of Social Housing and Democracy in the Americas. I thought an alternative title for this chapter could be A Tale of Two Cities, since they seem to be talking about two major civilizations in the area of what we would call central Mexico today. And so that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. I basically have a rough outline of what happened with each of the two cities and a handful of questions. So I don't have a strong preference about how we move through the chapter. You know, sometimes we go from the beginning of the chapter to the end, and we can do that too. But we can kind of jump back and forth between them as well, depending on what you guys feel most interested in talking about. But maybe we could just start with breaking down what these two cities are. First of all, the pronunciation is one thing. Yeah. The pronunciation was really challenging me in this chapter, and I was like just trying to remember how the audiobook reader had done it when I listened to the book. So just for these two cities, and hopefully we don't have to say a bunch of other names that I'm not prepared to say, but for these I'm going with Teotihuacan for the big ancient city, and then Tlaxcala, something like that, Tlaxcala for the other one, the Tlaxcala.
Accurate,
So yeah, what was Teotihuacan? What was Teotihuacan? What do we want to say about that city?
They line it out somewhere. Teotihuacan. So they built giant monoliths of like pyramids and things, and then the city changed and it focused more on urban housing, right? Like everything became apartments, essentially.
So that was the city they were talking about that went through, like, you could watch like the generational changes, right? Like it looked like it was on the trajectory to kind of turn into a really hierarchical society. But then they kind of started breaking down like when the different monuments were built and what they were used for at different times, and talked about how like it went from being, you know, like I think the temple was like a sacrifice temple to like still holding different events, but not necessarily to like kill people. But just that at some point, like that entire society changed. I actually had a big section of this highlighted on page 342 if you want me to read it. Oh, you want to talk about that first? Yeah.
I don't necessarily want to talk about this, but I just thought as a visual, and sort of related to what you're saying about the different stages of development for the city, one thing they point out in the chapter with archaeological evidence is like some of these maps are really compelling and interesting to look at, and we try to figure out the story. But I think a good point they make about a distortion of the maps is it sort of collapses all of the history of that place into a single image, and it makes it hard to tease out the timeline of what happened. Sort of to your point about, you know, the pyramids going up and then everything stopping, and now there's a big social housing project going on. And so when we look at this map, it just all gets smushed together as a single picture. But trying to figure out the story of the city, like how did it start, how did it change, how did it end? I don't know, maybe we could talk about some of that. But yeah, maybe the passage you were about to read is related to that.
Yeah. So,
or not, go for it either way.
Actually, yeah, I think it's pretty close to that. So it kind of starts on 341, and I'm not going to read this entire passage, but this page really talks about kind of like how it was like moving toward like the classical Mesoamerican civilization with strong traditions of warrior aristocracy and city-states. And then it says, so that's 341, like third paragraph down. In fact, the entire trajectory of Teotihuacan's political development seems to have gone off on a remarkable tangent. Instead of building palaces and elite quarters, the citizens embark on a remarkable project of urban renewal supplying high-quality apartments for nearly all the city's population, regardless of wealth or status. Without written sources, we can't really say why. Archaeologists are not yet able to distinguish the precise sequence of events now with any confidence, but nobody doubts that something did happen, and what we will try to do is now sketch out what that was. And then, like, the whole next page goes into a ton of detail on exactly all of that. I don't know if we want to read that whole thing, or maybe if one of us wants to read the first paragraph.
Those two middle paragraphs?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I can read those real quick, and then you can keep going. They say at this point, all new pyramid construction stopped permanently, and there's no further evidence of ritually sanctioned killing at the established pyramids of the sun and moon, which remained in use as civic monuments until around AD 550, albeit for other less lethal purposes about which we know little. Instead, what we see after AD 300 is an extraordinary flow of urban resources into the provision of excellent stone-built housing, not just for the wealthy or privileged, but for the great majority of Teotihuacan's population. These impressive apartments laid out in regular plots from one end of the city to the other were probably not an innovation of this period. Their construction on a city grid may have begun a century or so earlier, as did the raising of older and more ramshackle dwellings to make way for them. Archaeologists at first considered the masonry apartments to be palaces, and it is possible that is exactly how they began around AD 200, when the city seemed set on a course of political centralization. But after AD 300, when the Temple of the Feathered Serpent was desecrated, their construction continued apace until most of the city's 100,000 or so residents were effectively living in palatial, or at least very comfortable conditions. So what were these apartments like, and what kind of homes did people make in them?
What kind of stuck out to me, or what I was thinking about, was I was lucky enough to go to Petra in Jordan, and like when you're walking through there, you see like the houses that are literally carved in stone, like carved into the walls and stuff, and like can imagine like a very similar society, just like living in these kind of like nicer, like constructed buildings and dwellings that everyone kind of communally takes care of. That was just, I really like that kind of explanation of the quality of the living space, and it doesn't really matter of who's going where, right? Like, thought it was good.
Yeah, and I guess that map on, what is there, 338 or 339, all the little tiny grids, I guess, are the walls of all these houses. Like, I don't know, there's so many houses just scattered throughout the city.
I was just going to say the grid system and the barrios, how they have like, the actual ethnic enclaves, but they're like, organized in the grid and part of like the larger cities. Really neat too.
Yeah, so I was thinking, just trying to wrap our heads around the timeline of how the city came into being and all these changes. The rough outline that I have, because the way they talk about this is that even at the time that it existed, this Teotihuacan, which was apparently from around 100 BC to AD 600, so around 700 years or so that the city was around, even at the time it was sort of talked about possibly as like a city of the gods by other populations in surrounding areas. Like maybe not everybody lived there, or maybe not everybody has been to it, but everyone knows about it because it's the big city on the hill kind of in this timeline. So one of the reasons they give for how the city came in had to do with seismic activity, volcanoes in the area causing a lot of displacement and different groups moving around. And so maybe the city became a kind of centralized place of refuge for a lot of these displaced groups who were escaping volcanoes and earthquakes. And that possibly is like an origin of how it became so ethnically stratified into different neighborhoods, all these different little pockets of slightly different cultures and civilizations and stuff. But some hierarchical-minded people obviously started taking charge of the city at the beginning, and then these pyramids started getting constructed, and there's all this evidence of ritual killing, and like sound like they're actually using bodies to like lay out the pattern of the walls of the pyramids in some cases. So really strange stuff, really like hierarchical king-like behavior or whatever. And then some, like we had just pointed to a minute ago in that passage you pointed it out, Cody, of how construction began on some of these nicer apartments, right? And maybe that was something that was started as like an elite class, we can imagine. And they talked about there being like shanty neighborhoods in the earlier stages of the city. And so if you imagine at the time being one of those shanty dwellers and seeing these priestly caste of people who sacrifice your buddies all the time, building these nice palatial houses for themselves, you might start rubbing elbows with each other like, wait a minute, what's going on here? What are they about to try to get away with? And then all the pyramid construction stops, and then all these nice houses just get built all the way across the city. And we can just kind of imagine what that life was like after that point. So the last 300 years or so of the city obviously weren't perfect because it fell apart. Everyone dispersed eventually. It didn't last. There was obviously some tension simmering there that they allude to. But what kind of semi-egalitarian life are we talking about after the period of pyramid construction stopped?
I mean, definitely. It's like, I think they said estimated, 90%ish or so of people are living in the same manner, like similar apartments, similar, like everybody has a courtyard and whatever. Like they all have the equal amenities, and it's pretty cool. It's like one, it's really interesting how there's a theme of burning temples with revolt, and how we see that in like the Ukrainian villages too, and and like throughout history. So that's an interesting thing. Instead of repurposing it or something, like they burn it down to this mass scale that doesn't require hierarchy that Europeans say they invented. It's already present here in the in the Americas.
Yeah, and I think you were asking like, how did it talk about that living? Under that paragraph that I read earlier, it was talking about what that, like, just the lives that people were living there, and evidence suggests we should picture small groups of nuclear families living comfortable lives in single-story buildings, each equipped with integral drainage facilities and finely plastered floors and walls. Each family seems to have had its own set of rooms within the larger apartment block, complete with private porticos where light entered the otherwise windowless rooms. We can deduce that the average apartment compound would have housed in total around 100 people who have encountered each other routinely in a central courtyard, which also seems to have been the focus of domestic rituals, perhaps jointly observed. Most of these communal spaces were fitted with altars in the standard style of civic construction known as alud talebro, and the walls were often brightly painted with murals. Some courtyards had pyramid-shaped shrines, suggesting this architectural form had taken on new and less exclusive roles within the city.
Sounds pretty cozy.
Yeah.
Sounds like, and I don't know, we were talking, it's starting to get kind of cold, so I'll build a fire sometimes in our fireplace, and I was struggling yesterday to get a fire started, and Katie was like, it's so weird how it's hard to get a fire started in a fireplace, but then these houses we live in can just go up like a match because they're made of sticks and wrapped with paper and plastic. Right, and just thinking about how well built these stone houses are, it's impossible to burn a house down like that. Like, it's just made out of stone. Like, it's so solid. So yeah, very cozy living setups. And like, just how massive this is too. It's a city of 100,000 people. Roughly everybody is getting some kind of accommodation similar to this. And the question immediately comes up, well, what kind of hierarchy did they have? What kind of organization was it? Who was in charge of, making sure everything ran appropriately or whatever? And it's a conundrum that we come into, like, trying to understand history in cities or organizations that don't make sense to us, that don't conform to our expectations or whatever. They have some guesses. Further down the bottom of that page that you just finished on, Cody, the bottom of 343. I'm just going to read that paragraph and the one after it to talk about some speculations they make about how it was organized in terms of government or bureaucracy. They say both forms of urban community existing alongside one another retained a human scale, a world away from our modern conception of the housing estate, in which nuclear families are sequestered by the thousands in multi-story monoliths. By the way, I just thought that was a beautiful way to describe an apartment complex. So we are back to the question with which we started. What held this new Teotihuacan together, if not a hereditary elite or some other type of governing class? Without written evidence, it may never be possible to reconstruct the details, but by now we can probably rule out any sort of top-down system in which elite cadres of royal administrators or priests drew up plans and sent out orders. A more likely possibility is that authority was distributed among local assemblies, perhaps answerable to a governing council. If any trace of these community associations survives, it is in the district shrines known as three temple complexes. At least 20 such complexes were dispersed throughout the city, serving a total of 2,000 apartments, one for every 100 apartment blocks. This might imply the delegation of government to neighborhood councils with constituencies similar in size to those of Mesopotamian city wards or the assembly houses of Ukrainian megasites we discussed in Chapter 8, or for that matter, the barrios of later Mesoamerican towns. It may seem hard to imagine a city this size running successfully in this way for centuries without strong leaders or an extensive bureaucracy, but as we'll see, first-hand accounts of later cities from the time of the Spanish conquest lend credence to the idea. So that kind of distributed, broken down neighborhood by neighborhood level of council rule sounds great. How do we get there? How do we make it happen?
Yeah, where every neighborhood, every barrio has its own blueprint layout for like organization. So you don't really need like centralized rule, I guess, right? We just got to empower our city councils, put them above our Congress people,
One of the Substack people I follow might have, I think maybe it was Ken Klippenstein, was making that claim that basically, like, in light of Trump's fascism, it seems like politically cities are becoming the place of resistance. Like, what city mayors are doing, what city councils are doing to resist ICE and stuff like that. It's less and less about states' rights or counties or whatever, but like individual cities like are doing a lot of that resistance experimentation at the moment. So there might be something to that. Bring back the city-state? Question mark?
I think that's what they're trying to do. But do you think it's like more civic involvement with the structures we currently have, or do you think it's like a complete restructuring of those structures, I guess?
Yeah, part of me wants to say it's obviously the first thing, because you have to work with what's here. You have to work with the resources that are present. It's a lot easier to adapt a world this is the main argument against colonizing Mars. It's like, we have a planet already. Let's work on this one and fix this one and make it habitable instead of just imagining some other planet we can use. Same thing with the structures and resources and societies we already have in place. This is the one we've got, so what can we do to it to improve it and make life better for everybody? My feeling about it starts with some basic like civic infrastructure, like public libraries and post offices, for example. Can we turn public libraries and post offices into sites of mutual aid distribution and for organizing communities together? Bernie Sanders has pitched the idea of using the post offices as like a community bank system for people to go to instead of having to depend on big banks and things like that. And then there's grocery stores. I would love for food to not be for profit and instead just be for even distribution. So grocery stores, if they could be unionized and nationalized and sort of like democratically controlled by neighborhoods, I think that would also be a huge... But so those are institutions that are already in place. And it has to do with, how do you organize in a way that allows us to democratically on a neighborhood level control those institutions?
I guess the thing that popped into my head right away was farmers markets, but kind of.
Thing that popped into my head was, where's the profit? I love that. Yeah, I often think about like how France has some like countrywide bread. Oh my God, I don't even know the term. But, they essentially subsidize bread or something, like the cost of bread for the citizens, so that bread, a baguette cannot cost over £3, whatever it is. And it's like, come on, what are we doing here?
Hey,
we can't subsidize
do that.
food.
We do the same thing. It's just gas. We do it with gas.
I think gas might be it must cost at least $3 a gallon, or at least, I don't know. It makes getting a little wanderlust thinking about not just different places that do it better than us, but different times that did it better than us. I have a lot of mixed emotions reading about all this historical stuff, because it's inspiring on one level, and then it's also frustrating, like, oh, well, shit, we're still stuck in this one. Yeah. So, but when it comes to Tlaxcala, this later city-state that Cortez ran into, right off the bat, what like struck you as interesting about Tlaxcala?
Functioning indigenous democracy. Like the whole myth of Cortez coming, the Spanish coming, and wow, here actually is a enormous city. I think was it like 150,000, but it was a dense.
Trying to find it. Yeah, they said that they gave at least 20,000 warriors.
Yeah. I think the city they were trying to take was 150,000, and these guys gave them 20,000 warriors.
But yeah, it's surrounded by Aztec territory.
Yeah, so there's kind of like some schismogenesis going on with this place, and they call it the Aztec Triple Alliance.
Oh,
I don't
that's
know
right.
enough about Aztec politics, but apparently there were like three big city-states that made up the Aztec Empire. And so the Aztecs were like were an empire. They're trying to colonize local groups and get more land, get more stuff. And Tlaxcala was like a holdout, like, oh no, we're not you. We don't want that. We don't want you guys. So there was always like some resistance there. And so that's the world that Cortez came into, this whole narrative we get about these quote unquote primitive indigenous people just totally wowed by the guns and the horses and the technology, and these must be the gods coming back again, and let's just give up and lay down and not put up a fight. Cortez had 1,000 people. These states had hundreds of thousands of citizens. Like, the idea that they could do that was insane. So obviously there's some politics going on. Cortez is trying to work his way through the land and take local cities and stuff, and he ends up fighting Tlaxcala, these warriors from Tlaxcala. I think at some point they say that the Tlaxcalan leaders realized that they could probably take Cortez and his people if they really wanted to. They could probably wipe them out, but that they'd lose a lot of lives doing it. And so they just sort of pulled back and stopped fighting. And so these conversations popped up because Tlaxcala also wanted the Aztecs to go away. And here's this Spaniard who's going through and trying to conquer stuff. Maybe if we help him. So yeah, how did that negotiation, I don't know, all the drama about that negotiation process is interesting. And they get into all the scholarship and how the good scholarship got buried for hundreds of years, and then people found it and it resurfaced and it's still barely translated. And there's all this drama with the scholarship always. That story of how Tlaxcala decided to help, the debate they had, that's kind of where I want to take it. What did you guys think about that stuff?
Yeah. Something at the earlier end of that I really liked was their description of what like the Aztec Empire would say about Tlaxcala, like how they were saying like, oh, we let them kind of live over there. They're fine. Like we always need like somebody for our guys to like train weapons on, stuff like that. Which was funny. Well, not funny to me, but like there was almost like a comparison of like, I don't know, Russia, Ukraine in some ways, like, oh, we could end this war in a day, right? Like if we wanted to. We're just same thing with Palestine and Israel. Anyway, so like that kind of talk there. But then it had this description of Tlaxcala, and it said, but this was Bragadicio. In fact, Tlaxcala and its army guerrilla units had been holding the Aztecs successfully at bay for generations. Their resistance was not just military. Tlaxcala cultivated a civic ethos that worked against the emergence of ambitious leaders and hence potential geislings, a counterexample to Aztec principles of governance. And then it kind of goes on to like this, that comparison that you were talking about between Sparta and Athens before. So I just like that kind of like intro into that, like what that relationship was actually like between these two, country or cities.
Yeah, very like empire heavy, and then like a would-be colonized group is just viciously fighting back and not giving up. And, the guerrilla warfare aspect was kind of interesting. We think that all this stuff is just European history, but all this stuff is going on in a totally different context outside of that influence altogether. There are examples of empire and examples of democracy in indigenous worlds before Europeans arrived at all. And it's just kind of fascinating to get the political nuance of what was going on in the Americas before the colonizers came over. Tlaxcala had a governing council. They had like a representative council, and there's like all this talk about how that happened. I'll just read these 3 paragraphs, starting on 355 and carrying over into 356 a little bit, but it gets into sort of how Tlaxcala's democracy might have worked. So the authors write, but a strong case can be made that the deliberations recorded in Spanish sources are exactly what they seem to be. And maybe we can go back and read a little bit about that debate in particular after we talk about this. A glimpse into the mechanics of collective indigenous government, and if these deliberations bear any superficial resemblance to debates recorded in Thucydides or Xenophon, this is because, well, there are really only so many ways to conduct a political debate. At least one Spanish source provides explicit information in this regard. Here we turn to Friar Toribio of Benavente, called by locals Motolinia, the afflicted one, for his ragged appearance, a sobriquet he seems to have happily adopted. It is to Motolinia and his Tlaxcalteca informants, who included Antonio, Xicotencatl, most likely a grandson of Xicotencatl the Elder, that we owe the Historia de los Indios de la Nueva España. Motolinia confirms Cortez's original observation that Tlaxcala was indeed an indigenous republic governed not by a king nor even by rotating office holders, as at Cholula, but by a council of elected officials, tuctly answerable to the citizenry as a whole. Exactly how many sat on the High Council of Tlaxcala is not clear. Spanish sources suggest any number from 50 to 200. Perhaps it depended on the matter at hand. Neither, unfortunately, does he tell us anything in detail about how these individuals were selected for office or who was eligible. Other Pueblan cities, including royal ones, rotated official duties among representatives of Copoli. On the topic of Tlaxcalteca modes of political training and instruction, however, Motolinia's account comes alive. Those who aspired to a role on the Council of Tlaxcala, far from being expected to demonstrate personal charisma or the ability to outdo rivals, did so in a spirit of self-deprecation, even shame. They were required to subordinate themselves to the people of the city. To ensure that the subordination was no mere show, each was subject to trials, starting with mandatory exposure to public abuse, regarded as the proper reward of ambition, and then, with one's ego in tatters, a long period of seclusion in which the aspiring politician suffered ordeals of fasting, sleep deprivation, bloodletting, and a strict regime of moral instruction. The initiation ended with a coming out of the newly constituted public servant amid feasting and celebration. As an alternative way of selecting and training their office holders, there is another method to consider.
It's almost like sending someone through boot camp. Actually, Joe, I had the very next paragraph kind of like highlighted as something that was worth talking about as well, because I just thought it was interesting. But it says, clearly taking up office in the indigenous democracy required personality traits very different to those we take for granted in modern electoral politics. On this latter point, it is worth recalling that ancient Greek writers were well aware of the tendency for elections to throw up charismatic leaders with tyrannical pretensions. This is why they were quite at odds with democratic principles, and why for much of European history, the truly democratic way of filling offices was assumed to be by lottery. I thought it would be like, I was just kind of imagining what that might look like in a society if it's like, I want to apply for a certain job and you take like whatever aptitude tests, and then there's this big pool of qualified candidates for certain positions, and then it's just like the lottery, this number comes up, and then like, okay, well, you are now serving as the town councilman for this place for 2 years, and then the other person just, or you could even select like here, like the different offices I'd be interested in and like working for, and whatever you're qualified for, you're kind of put into a lottery for it.
I love that. Yeah. Lottery system. Definitely. You're now president.
We have the technology to do that. Like, I don't know, part of the most difficult part of doing a system like that is organizing it, just like getting all the paperwork in order, making sure the rotation is fair and equitable to everybody. But so many people are so good at Excel. You know, just think about all the amazing Excel spreadsheets you've seen or worked with in your life. Like, that's all it takes is some Excel sheet warriors to organize the rotation sufficiently enough for everyone to get a chance to go on rotation, to have time off. Yeah, like the technology exists to do that already. It's just the will? I don't know.
Also, back to Arthur's point, that's communist. You can't make money off of that.
Yeah,
So,
come on. I highlighted the debate they had in like 1519 or something, you know, whether or not to join Cortez. And I really liked the line on 353 in the senior Xicotencatl. Okay. How did you say it, Joe?
I think I said Xicotencatl.
Xicotencatl. You know, at the end of his speech where he says, "Why would we who live without servitude and never acknowledged a king spill our blood only to make ourselves into slaves?" Yeah, listen to that guy. You know?
Yeah, I think this whole event, this whole story needs like the grand Hollywood treatment to really bring it to life. Like it could, even this scene right after this. So like, yeah, there's Maxis Katzen, who's sort of like the pragmatist, who's like, oh, maybe we should align with Cortez. Maybe it's not a bad idea. And then Xicotencatl, the elder, comes back with this fiery, eloquent speech about, no, everything you just alluded to, Arthur. And there was, tension between the two. There's not a clear direction for the people to go. The next paragraph, they say, members of the council, we learn, were swayed by Xicotencatl's words. A murmur began among them, speaking with each other. The voices were rising, each one declaring what he felt. The council was divided and without consensus. What followed would be familiar to anyone who has participated in a process of consensus decision-making. When matters seem to come to loggerheads, rather than putting it to a vote, someone proposes a creative synthesis. Another name, Tenochtitlan, one of the city's 4 senior justices, so the Supreme Court stepped in with a cunning plan. To satisfy both sides of the debate, Cortez would be invited into the city, but as soon as he entered Tlaxcalteca territory, the city's leading general, Xicotencatl the Younger, would ambush him, together with a contingent of Otomi warriors. If the ambush succeeded, they would be heroes. If it failed, they would blame it on the uncouth and impulsive Otomi, make their excuses, and ally themselves with the invaders. Seems like it went the second way.
Yeah, it didn't actually confirm, did that happen? Wait, it said that was what was proposed?
Yeah, so I try to look at some of the footnotes occasionally. Like in the next paragraph, they say, we need not rehearse here the events leading to an alliance between Tlaxcala and Cortez. So it's sort of known in general that Tlaxcala lent 20,000 warriors to Cortez and helped him overthrow the Aztecs. And then we didn't hear about Tlaxcala after that because they basically got colonized by the Spaniards. But the footnote there for 56 points to a source, Hasig. I could look at the bibliography to figure out what the full citation is of that. But they said this other writer, Hasig, provides a summary of the standard account, drawing mainly on Bernal Diaz del Castillo. He considers possible factors behind the Spanish execution of Xicotencatl the Younger, who died by hanging at the age of 37. So the Spaniards hung the guy who staged that ambush.
Interesting.
Afterwards.
Man, so they tried to get tricky with it, and it didn't work, and then they got colonized anyway, instead of just full-on attacking.
I missed the paragraph where Cortez enters the city and everybody just bows down to him and his horse and his shiny metal. That's what I was taught, and I don't know, I didn't get that.
Was Jesus on his shoulder? Or that was...
I guess the main thing that I'm thinking of, and maybe I want to read the last bit of this chapter, plagiarism. I think I was trying to make a point about plagiarism and how it's not just that colonists, when they came to the Americas, did genocide, took over a bunch of land, stole a bunch of resources, stole people from Africa, brought them over to do work for free. Not only did they do all of this, but perhaps they plagiarized the whole idea of democratic governance from indigenous societies altogether. That's sort of the scandal of this chapter, I feel like, and how it ends. And so I thought I would read a little bit from the end of the chapter just because they wrap up some of these ideas and point toward the next chapter, which is all about the concept of the state. So it's sort of leading us into the territory of the next chapter. So just making a decision here. I'll read 357 and 358, these last 2 pages of the chapter. So they're talking about how Tlaxcalans and Aztec people in general saw themselves in relationship to history. I'll start at the bottom of 356 because that context is important. So Cortez may have praised Tlaxcala as an agrarian and commercial Arcadia, but as Modellina explains, when its citizens thought about their own political values, they actually saw those values as coming from the desert. Like other Nahuatl speakers, including the Aztecs, Tlaxcalteca liked to claim that they were descended from Chichimec. These were considered the original hunter-gatherers who lived ascetic lives in deserts and forests, dwelling in primitive huts, ignorant of village or city life, rejecting corn and cooked food, bereft of clothing or organized religion, and living on wild things alone. The ordeals endured by aspiring counselors in Tlaxcala were reminders of the need to cultivate Chichimec qualities, ultimately to be balanced by the Toltec virtues of an urbane warrior and just where the correct balance lay was much debated among the Tlaxcalteca. If all this sounds a little familiar, we must ask ourselves why. The Spanish friars will no doubt have heard echoes in these tales of old world tropes for republican virtue, that same atavistic streak running from the biblical prophets through the Ibn Khaldun, not to mention their own ethic of world renunciation. The correspondences are so close that one begins to wonder if, in their autoethnography, the Tlaxcalteca in this case actually did present themselves to Spaniards in terms they knew would be instantly recognized and understood. Certainly, we know that the citizens of Tlaxcala staged some remarkable theatrical spectacles for the benefit of their conquerors, including a 1539 pageant of the Crusader Conquest of Jerusalem, in which the climax was a mass baptism of actual pagans dressed as Moors. Spanish observers may even have learned from Tlaxcalteca or Aztec sources what it means to have once been a quote-unquote noble savage, nor can we rule out the possibility that indigenous Mexican ideas on the subject entered wider streams of European political thought that gathered force only in the days of Rousseau, whose State of Nature maps with alarming fidelity onto Motolinea's account of the Chichimec, right down to the primitive hut dwellings in which they were supposed to have lived. Perhaps some of the seeds of our own evolutionary story about how it all began with simple egalitarian hunter-gatherers were sown right there in the imaginations of city-dwelling Amerindians. But we digress. Amid all this mutual positioning, what can we really conclude about the political constitution of Tlaxcala at the time of the Spanish conquest? Was it really a functioning urban democracy, and if so, how many other such democracies might have existed in the pre-Columbian Americas? Or are we confronting a mirage, a strategic conjuring of the ideal commonwealth supplied to a receptive audience of millenarian friars? Were elements of history and mimesis both at work? If all we had to go on were written sources, there would always be room for doubt, but archaeologists confirm that by the 14th century AD, the city of Tlaxcala was in fact already organized on an entirely different basis to Tenochtitlan. There is no sign, Tenochtitlan I think is like the main city of the Aztecs. There is no sign of a palace or central temple and no major ball court, an important setting recall for royal ritual in other Mesoamerican cities. Instead, archaeological survey reveals a cityscape given over almost entirely to the well-appointed residences of its citizens, constructed to uniformly high standards around more than 20 district plazas, all raised up on grand earthen terraces. The largest municipal assemblies were housed in a civic complex called Tezatlan, but this was located outside the city itself, with spaces for public gatherings entered via broad gateways. Modern archaeological investigations thus confirm the existence of an indigenous republic at Tlaxcala long before Cortés set foot on Mexican soil, while later written sources leave us in little doubt as to its democratic credentials. The contrasts with other known Mesoamerican cities of the time are quite striking, though it should also be said that 5th century Athens was something of an outlier, surrounded by petty kingdoms and oligarchies. Nor should these contrasts be overdrawn. What we have learned in this chapter is that the political traditions of Tlaxcala are not an anomaly, but lie in one broad stream of urban development, which can be traced back in outline to the experiments in social welfare undertaken 1,000 years earlier at Teotihuacan. Despite Aztec claims to be a special relationship with that abandoned city, Tlaxcala was at least as much a part of its legacy as the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, and in most really significant ways more so. After all, it was the Aztec rulers of Tenochtitlan who finally broke with tradition, creating a predatory empire that was in some ways closer to the dominant European political models of the time, or what has since come to be known as the state. In the next chapter, we intend to turn back and consider this term. What precisely is a state? Does it really mark an entirely new phase of human history? Is the term even useful anymore?
I tend to forget about the Aztec Empire and like being imperialistic and whatnot. It makes me want to like just go research that more because like it's, I guess like you said, or I guess the book has been pointing out along the way, right? Like seen both of these things rise up in different ways, right? The ones that are dominant seem to create a lot more waste and be much more prominent for history to observe. But yeah, something that would be good to learn more about.
Yeah, that's a good archaeological point too. It's just like the reason perhaps that our stories so heavily favor these empires and hierarchies and stuff is, like you said, they just create so much more stuff to analyze. Like they want to leave big monuments. They want to, You just think about skyscrapers today. If our civilization just totally crumbled, what would archaeologists 1,000 years from now, what stories would they create about the purpose of all of our skyscrapers if none of our written records or digital records survived?
I think they'd uncover the capitalist system pretty quickly, you know? They'd be seeing the high rises for sure.
They're just all the like single-use plastics, like everywhere they come across the piles of those.
Yeah, it depends. I guess if the billionaires get their bunkers and they like get to erase history and rewrite it like, you know, the Spanish do here.
I didn't think about that.
Have you guys played the Horizon games?
No.
The first one, yeah.
I played both of them, but they kind of play with this idea. It's like 1,000-ish years in the future, but on Earth, and like there's all sorts of AI storylines and I don't know. But it's basically doing the same question. They're just like skyscrapers and cars and stuff overgrown with plants.
That's PS5 or PS.
I think
on
the
PlayStation.
Yeah, it's on PlayStation. I think it started on PS4. Now it's on PS5. But good, really good games, like really fun open world games. Lots of good lessons about how to work together as a community, how to care about the environment, and you get to like fight all these killer robots in the meantime. So it's a fun game. If you like Skyrim, I think people who like that type of game, who like Skyrim, will enjoy the Horizon games a lot.
Nice.
Unless you hate women and don't want to play a game where a woman is the main character. But otherwise, yeah. This book's kind of a slog at this point. It's dragging on and on, but it's always interesting. It's just there's an endurance capacity to like reading really long books where even if you love it, at certain points you're like, oh, okay, I can keep going. But I like that they're circling back, like they did this whole big circle in history, and they're finally coming back to the colonial era and talking about how all these trains of thought intersected. And so it'll be interesting to return to some of those debates with like Candia Runk and some of the stuff that we talked about in the first episodes. So join us next time where we continue with The Dawn of Everything and discuss why the state has no origin, the humble beginnings of sovereignty, bureaucracy, and politics. That's it for this week's episode. Thanks so much for listening and hanging out with us.
If you enjoy the show, help us spread the word. Leave a rating or review and share it with your friends, family, or anyone who would get something out of these conversations.
Your ratings, reviews, and shares help this show grow. And the more people listening, the harder it is for propaganda to win.
So until next time.
Stay aware, stay safe, and remember,
Propaganda loves you.